Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program today, the final part in our webinar series on your career in transition. Really delighted to have you joining us today. I'm Greg Stevens from Purple Cow Career and Talent Development, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the closing of this 8-part webinar series. Today, of course, we'll be talking about interviewing. For those of you who have joined in other webinars in this series, thank you for joining us again. And for those of you for whom this is the first time, you're welcome, quite welcome as well. You'll see at the bottom of this list, I've indicated beyond today's program, what's next. As we go through the program, I would love to have your ideas about some other career-related topics that might be of use to you in future programs. So feel free throughout the program or at the tail end to type in a few ideas. I'm delighted, really delighted to welcome my colleague and friend, Gail Anderson, who is the president of Gail Anderson and Associates in beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico, my home state. Gail, welcome from Santa Fe.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here.
And I'm a little jealous, just even looking at your home right now, just a little jealous of how beautiful it is. So I hope it's gorgeous in Santa Fe right now.
Yeah.
Of course, as you might see on the screen, Gail Anderson is also the author of a terrific book, Mission Matters, Relevance and Museums in the 21st Century, which I use in several of my courses at Seton Hall University. And Gail is also the editor of Reinventing the Museum, the evolving conversation on the paradigm shift, which I also use in my courses with my students. So Gail, you're a bit of a household name to our students, and I'm sure many students and museum colleagues around the country. But Gail, you're also got a lot of experience in career management and recruiting and interviewing folks for jobs. And so of course, that's why I've asked you to join our program today. So thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Just a very quick recap of what we've been through this entire series. We've been talking about your career path and how many of you are in transition right now, whether you've been laid off or furloughed, or your institutions are closed and you're working from home, or maybe you're graduating from school and looking for your first job, or maybe you're in between jobs. All kinds of reasons why you might be in transition regarding your career right now. Some of you may have a direction, you may have a path that you're already going on. Some of you may have many options available to you. Some of you may be momentarily lost, but have some kind of a roadmap. And I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel a little bit unsure about what the future holds. So hopefully some of this series and today's program will address some issues for you. Earlier on in the program, we learned that many of us are on various stages of grief about our own career transitions, and it's really okay whether we are frustrated or depressed or really moving forward. We learned from Marcia Semmel that we are indeed in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. I think that goes without saying. But this is an important backdrop for our conversation about careers. We've also talked quite a bit about the importance of relationships. And in the context of our careers, our professional relationships matter now more than ever. Really important as we all go through our careers to keep them strong and reach out to our colleagues. We talked a little bit about 6 skills for leaders at all levels, whether you're the director or an administrative assistant. And those skills, strategic agility, relationship building, communication, data fluency, prototyping, and systems leadership, or seeing the big picture, are all critical for any of us working in whatever field. I know that many of you are in the museum field, but we've got lots of folks who are outside of the museum field. We also took a quick look at the skills and competencies that are being required of people in the workforce now. We looked across a variety of institutions and identified some themes and patterns like critical thinking and problem solving, communication, teamwork, collaboration, flexibility, data literacy, social media, lots of patterns for you to start thinking about your career and how you can identify your own skills. We offered you a couple of easy steps that you can take to making a list of all the things that you're good at and passionate about and codifying those into what we called your personal brand, or an opportunity to tell a compelling story about who you are as a professional. We talked about if you are looking for a job right now, as many of you may be, and you're looking at job descriptions, how important it is now more than ever to pay attention to the job description and to really emphasize those keywords and phrases that appear in the job description, and use those keywords and phrases in your resume and your cover letter and your online profile. We talked a little bit about the reality check, that there are many, many people looking for jobs. And so you might be competing with 100 or more colleagues for the same job. So all the more reason for you to really highlight those key skills, because if you're not highlighting what they need, your application materials may go into the circular file or the trash can. We did a quick review of resumes, and last time we talked about cover letters, and we talked really about how both the resume and the cover letter work together as a unified package to sell you to the recruiter, the hiring manager, the HR director, whoever is involved with setting up interviews. And so the real purpose of the resume and the cover letter is to get you that interview. So today, we're going to talk about interviewing, and the name of this program is Interview Like a Star, because we're going to talk about a STAR model that I like to use with my colleagues and my clients in helping prepare for interviews. We're going to take a look at interviewing from both sides, which is why, Gail, I asked you to come on board, because you've got so much experience in recruiting and reviewing application materials. I think your perspective is going to be really valuable throughout our program. We're going to take a quick look at what you all should be doing before, during, and after the interview, and then we'll offer some opportunity for some questions. But let's start off with a question in the chat box, as we like to do in this series, and find out from you what you all think an interview is. I think we have a general sense of what an interview is, but I'd love to see in the chat box what you all have to say. So let's just take a quick look and type something into the chat box, and let's find out what you think an interview is. Christina, thanks. An opportunity to learn about each other. Yeah, an opportunity to learn beyond what the resume says. Angela, the most terrifying thing known to man. Yeah. Hannah says it should be a conversation. Joanna says a dress rehearsal. I like that. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing, Gail?
Well, what I like is the way the people that are participating are looking at it in a very positive way, and a way to present themselves in a way that can make a difference. So, I mean, I see that woven in through some of the responses there.
Yeah, it's definitely about impressions. It's about getting a good feel for the company and the team. Right. It goes both ways. But Angela, I had to laugh at your comment that it can be terrifying. I don't know about you, but in earlier years in my career, the idea of interviewing for a job mortified me. And I'm a pretty outgoing person, so you would think that it's pretty easy, but interviewing can be pretty rough for a lot of folks. So hopefully what we're going to talk about today helps prepare you a little bit for interviews. And so in addition to everything that you all just offered, really an interview is information sharing. And as many of you pointed out, the information goes both ways. So it's not just you being interviewed and you providing all the information. It's you as the interviewee getting information from the person or the people who are conducting the interview. In short form, really, the interview is about a knowledge share. It's about what you know about the work that the job you're applying for, the institution, what you know about the field in which you work. But it's also about your experience, what you have done. And this is where the interview is supported by your resume and your cover letter or your online profile, where you're capturing your experience, what you have done. And the interview is also about competency. It's about what you can do. Those of you who joined us for last time's program on cover letters, we talked about that main body of the cover letter being that bridge between who you are, what you know how to do, what you have done, and a bridge to the institution for this job, what you can do for them. And an interview is a way to solidify some of your competency. And as some of you already pointed out in the chat box, the interview is a way of getting to know you and getting to know each other. It's a way to identify some of your attributes or what motivates you. In an earlier webinar in this series, we talked about the importance of you all making a list of all the things you're good at and all the things you're passionate about. That wasn't just a hollow exercise, because those things come together in the interview format. As one of my colleagues in our book pointed out, the interview is really about competence, commitment, and chemistry. So it's about what you have done, what you know how to do. It's what you're committed to with regards to this job, this institution, this field, whatever your field may be, and that chemistry. And so I want to pause here for a moment and ask you, Gail, as I've just done a quick definition of interview, what are your thoughts about that from your perspective?
From a recruiter's perspective?
Yeah.
All right. Greg mentioned I've done recruiting, and so just to be very clear, I tend to do it for executive directors or senior level positions. So it's very highly competitive. And the moment when I decide to pursue someone for an interview, I will have looked at all the items you've mentioned, the cover letter, the resume, and really tried to assess it. Not sure if this is exactly the right place, but something that often jumps out at me is if people have jumped around from positions, so it's only about a year to 2 years per position, or there's a gap, that often then prompts a question I'd like to understand better about the person if the whole picture holds together and I want to pursue the interview.
Great. And what are your thoughts when I describe knowledge, experience, competency, and attributes? These are all things that you, I don't want to say filter for, but you're paying attention to all of these in whatever interview setting you might be. And we're going to talk about types of interviews in a moment.
Right. To me, the knowledge counts for a lot. I would say from where I sit, that ability, the experience, the evidence of similar types of positions, or the ability to process and achieve really significant, what's the word I'm looking for here, to make real achievements in a position, that matters. Now, and so obviously competency, but I'm also looking for a sense of poise, a sense of self-awareness, and that in a way those, the emotional intelligence, as Daniel Goleman talks about.
Absolutely.
I can sometimes sense it. Now, if it's only over a phone, then a phone interview, I know you're going to talk about that in a minute, then it has to really come through in the voice, the intonation, and then I want to see that they're listening. And maybe I'm jumping ahead into some of your other.
No. It's I'm really glad that you mentioned self-awareness and emotional intelligence. We talked about that a bit in an earlier webinar in the series, and I think that falls squarely in this category of attributes and
Yeah.
motivation. Really, how you communicate yourself, both in what you say and in nonverbal ways. Um, so I will talk about that a little bit more. And I know there's a couple of questions that have come in, and we'll get to them, but certainly about gaps in your resume, especially with the pandemic really disrupting a lot of folks' careers. So I definitely want to circle back around to that question, and also a comment about contractors or freelancers. So let's shift gears very quickly. And for many of you, you may have been on a variety of interviews, either a phone interview, that might be a screening interview. You might have advanced to a one-on-one interview via Skype or Zoom, or perhaps you were engaged in a panel interview virtually with a group, that the hiring committee at the institution, for example. You may have advanced to an in-person interview with a person, the hiring manager, the HR director, the director of the museum, or some such. And likely many of you have been involved in panel interviews face to face. And I mentioned these types of interviews because they all have similar characteristics, but they're all a little bit unique. And so I wonder, Gail, if you might take us through this pathway, if you will. So for example, when you are having a screening interview by phone, what is it you're really looking for?
Well, I've got a very prepared list of questions that I consistently ask of anyone I call. I inevitably am trying to get a sense of their ability to project confidence on a phone call, because that's one of the main ways that we communicate, and how they're able to present themselves. If they talk too much or are not attentive to the questions that I'm asking, then I have to end up managing them. And I've had interviews where the person gives a one sentence response, and then another one gives, keeps talking and talking and talking. So it's really taking the cue from the interviewer. And as an interviewer, I lay out what I'm going to do. I explain what my strategy is. I tell them the nature of the question so that they know. I also tell them how long we'll be on the phone, and that I will let them know what next steps, if any, will happen. So I do that. Would you like me to talk about these other?
Sure.
Sure. So once you're on a screen, you're able to convey a little bit of your posture, your personality, and that's very positive. So two of your examples, Greg, one is with a panel, and then one is the individual appears to be speaking with one person. I think what's harder, and I'll be honest, is that when you are communicating with a panel, you need to keep looking at the people that are interviewing you to sort of see, are they engaged? Are they doodling? What, and how attentive are they? And then to take the cues and to just say, well, hopefully that, say it however you will, but I hope that answers your question. And if they say, well, actually, we'd like you to expand a little bit more, they'll tell you. So it's about being really in the moment, listening and responding. The in-person interview, for me, that's always my favorite, because I'm a people person. So you can see their body language and start to make that connection. I don't know if this is the right place, but I'm going to share a couple of things that I really think you can't do when you are interviewing in person. Let the person tell you where to sit. Let the person, guide you. You very deferential to the person that's interviewing you. Do not, I know this is going to sound petty, put your purse or your paper on the person's desk, and you can put it on a chair next to you or in your lap. And the person may go, I can see that you're a little awkward. So it's fine if you set that on my desk. but there's a whole respectful approach that's critical. And then you've got the last one with the panel. Those are hard. And you are trying to both, read everyone, what they're saying. You have to know who the people are in advance, just as you do with the one on screen, and then do some homework about those individuals so you have a little bit of a sense of where they are in the organization and what their role is. Let me just stop there and see if you want to expand anything.
No, I think and we'll talk more about the various aspects of this, but I think your quick overview is really useful. I think one of the main points that you made just a few moments ago is by the time you even get to an interview,
right,
for you as the recruiter or the hiring manager, you've already filtered through how many ever applicants. You've already whittled it down from 100 to 20 or whatever that magic number is. You've already got a checklist of things that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. So this is really, as one of my colleagues in our book talked about, a process of elimination, really. Yep. So starting from the screening interview, your job is to filter out people to get to the top 5 or the top 3. So if you as the interviewer, the person being interviewed, think about it as a process of elimination, that means every step along the way. If you got to this first screening interview, that's fabulous. If you get to a Skype or a Zoom interview, that's even more fabulous. But you still have to continue being fabulous at every step of the way.
Right. I don't know if this is a good place to add, but for executive search, the other thing that can happen is when you are being interviewed, if you're looking at a director's position, you will be put in many different kinds of situations. You'll meet with the executive search committee. You may have lunch with various members of the staff. You may have a cocktail party with donors. They want to see how you perform, that you're multifaceted and that you're successful in all those different arenas. Now, these are very standard, but when you get to that upper level, you do have to be able to perform in a variety of ways and feel confident.
Right. And before we move on, I just want to pause and address a question that came in. You mentioned the importance of knowing who's going to be on the interview with you. Most of that information, not always, but it seems expected that you would know who you're going to be interviewing with. You're going to be interviewing with the HR director and the department director, or you're going to be interviewing with the committee of the board, or but part of that is on your shoulders, right, Gail, to
yes.
communicate that?
Absolutely. I mean, some of you may have deduced I'm a consultant, so I'm getting interviewed all the time for a project. And I can think of one that happened, I don't know, 6-8 months ago. And the director said, well, we'll have a number of board members. And I said, would you be so kind to share their names and their role on the board and anything that might be helpful for me to understand in advance? There are lots of very polite ways to ask, and sure enough, he identified who the individuals were and their role, up to, and even went so far to say, well, I'm making this up, George, he's a little conservative and he may not be, he's going to really want to hear you talk about X and Y. And I've even gone so far to say, what is it that they really would like to hear from me? But that's, of course, yeah.
I've definitely been on interviews where I've found out who I was going to be interviewing with, and then other interviews where I was not given that information. And I can tell you how frustrating it is. And James, you've shared this as well. When I've been able to know who I'm interviewing with, I have the opportunity to look them up. I can.
Oh, absolutely. You do your homework. Mm-hmm.
Do part of my homework. And if they're not going to share it with you, then they're not going to share it with you. There's not much you can do about that other than try to be fully present in the moment. I'm going to circle back around to some of these other questions in a little bit, but I want to jump into before the interview and what really needs to happen. On the interviewer side, so let's imagine, Gail, you're the interviewer, you're the recruiter.
Right.
You've already defined the attributes of an ideal.
Absolutely.
You've worked with whoever the key stakeholders are, the director, the hiring manager, whoever it is who needs to be involved to define what they're looking for in this position. You're the one responsible for the interview process. We'll start with a phone interview for screening, and then if we advance, it'll go on to a panel interview through Zoom, and then it may be an in-person interview if you get that far.
Right, right.
As we pointed out, you will have already reviewed applicant materials to get to this place. From the pile of 100, you've now reduced it to 20. You have the responsibility, as you and I have talked about, to know the law, know what can and cannot be asked in an interview setting.
Right.
On the interviewee side, this is your opportunity to take an inventory of those transferable skills. All those skills that we talked about earlier in the series, things that you're good at, the strengths you bring to the table, your competencies and how they relate to this particular job. This is also an opportunity, especially now when the job market is so chaotic. When we talk about transferable skills, they're probably more important than ever. You may be interviewing for jobs outside of your industry. And how can you maximize how you communicate about those transferable skills? Gail's already talked about how important it is to do your homework, to learn about the organization and learn about the job. That doesn't mean getting on the website the morning of your interview to sniff around. Because I think, Gail, you probably have some comments about this. Do your homework, and it's clear when you have not done your homework.
It is clear, and sometimes you have to go to places that are less obvious. Now, this is maybe a little less traditional, but if I know when I'm, again, at this upper level, I'm interviewing someone and I can tell from where they worked that I probably know someone from that institution, or I might be able to learn more about that individual, I might pursue it. Similarly, if you dig down deeper, you're the interviewee, it's not just the website. What kind of newspaper articles do a Google search. I mean, that's the advantage of it. And there might be somebody that you can take into your confidence who knows the organization and can perhaps impart some knowledge, but you have to be very careful about that. When you're interviewing, you need to keep it private. You do not want to be at a dinner party and telling everybody, oh, I'm going to apply at the the Newark Museum next week. You have to use a lot of discretion. Yeah.
Right. And we talked about the importance of keeping those things kind of quiet, in part because, especially in the museum field is very small, and you just never know who knows who, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
This bullet right here about preparing your toolkit, and when I think of the toolkit, I think of a leave behind, a beautiful folder with beautiful copies of my resume, my cover letter. Even if the recruiter or the committee already has copies of them electronically, likely that they probably printed them out on a printer, so they've just got them on copy paper in black and white. Here's your opportunity to produce a really lovely package. It's about the presentation. Also in that toolkit might be a writing sample, or it may be hard copies of essays they required of you. It might be some infographic or something that might be related to the work you do. Anything that is a leave behind, and make sure that you prepare enough for whoever it might be. If you're going to be interviewing 3 people, then you have 3 of these toolkits or these packets. If you're going to be interviewing 6, have enough. You certainly will want to practice answering some common interview questions, which we're going to talk about pretty extensively in a moment. And this is also your responsibility to know the rights and the law in whatever municipality or state you're in about what is permissible in an interview.
For example, in California, you can't ask what your prior salary was.
Right.
So
Right.
things that used to be kind of common are off the table. So it really, and it changes a lot. So it does behoove anyone applying to make sure that they're up on it.
Yeah, and that's your responsibility to know. Well, it's everybody's responsibility to know what's possible.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about some common interview questions, some general common interview questions from the recruiter or the hiring manager might be. So tell me about yourself. What can you tell me about you? What do you know about us? This is your opportunity to talk about how much you know about the organization. Let's say you visited that museum and you really love the work that they do in some specific way. We talked about that last time. They might ask you generally, what are you looking for in this job? And this is your opportunity to say something beyond, well, I don't have a job right now, so I need a job. Right? So you want to be specific about why you and why this job. A trickier question that they might ask you, and I've certainly been asked this, is why do you want to leave your current job? And the answer cannot be because I hate my boss and it's too much work and the hours are terrible. Those are the kind of responses you probably shouldn't give to these questions.
You could say, I feel that I'm ready for a new challenge. In other words, you own it. You can say that. You know, I'm looking to take on greater responsibilities. It's fine to say that.
Yeah. Another good question would be, what's the most difficult challenge you've ever faced on the job? That really gets at a lot. It gets at your knowledge, your experience, your competency, and also your motivation or your attributes, how you communicate that. And this last one that I've pulled up, tell me about a time when. The tell me about a time when questions fall into the category of what we call behavior-based or behavioral interview questions. And as the slide suggests here, behavioral interview questions are built around the premise that the best predictor of future behavior is relevant past behavior. So your past performance as you communicate it in the interview would be a pretty good indicator of what the organization would expect from you in the future. Not all the time and not a one-to-one correlation, but it's generally an accepted approach to interviewing. And so with that in mind, here are a handful of behavioral interview questions that I pulled from one of my favorite websites called themuse.com. So here's a couple of questions on teamwork. Tell me about a time when you had to work closely with someone whose personality was very different than yours. That's pretty standard. Give me an example of a time you faced a conflict while working on a team. How did you handle that? Or in the realm of adaptability, describe a time when your team or company was undergoing some change. How did that impact you and how did you adapt? Well, I think it stands to reason that here we are in pretty significant change in all of our institutions. So that would be a pretty good question to prepare for. Or tell me about a time you failed. Gail, you and I talked about this in planning this call. This is a pretty rich question to ask that can reveal a lot about you.
Right. I mean, if you're asked, explain a time when you failed and what did you do with the time and how might you deal with it differently if you could go back and relive that situation. It reveals humility. It reveals self-awareness, which I mentioned earlier, composure, because you cannot answer that question and put down a past employer. You've got to be very careful how you answer it. And how you
here's some other behavioral interview questions. Client-facing skills. Tell me about a time when you made sure a customer or a visitor was satisfied with your experience. Or describe a time when you had to interact with a difficult client or visitor. What was the situation and how did you handle it? Time management skills, like tell me about a time when your responsibilities got overwhelming. I'm sure that happens to all of us. What did you do? How did you deal with that? Tell me about a time when you had to manage multiple projects at once. This is a question that I've been asked on pretty much every interview that I've ever been on. Communication skills. Earlier on in our series, we talked about the importance of communication. So you might be asked a question like, tell me about a time when you had to rely on written communication to get your ideas across. Or tell me about a successful presentation you gave and why you think it was a hit. Or going back to attributes and characteristics, your motivations and values. Tell me about your proudest professional accomplishment, or describe a time when you saw some problem and took the initiative to correct it rather than waiting for somebody else to do it. So these are all types of behavioral interview questions, and there are many, many more, of course. But this is just a snapshot to set the stage for really what I think of as the core of an interview, and that is a STAR model that I like to use in my interview process when I'm working with clients or colleagues. And basically the STAR model is this: situation or task, action, and results. Behavioral interview questions can be answered when you respond very succinctly with a prepared STAR, in which you describe a particular situation or task, meaning what you did, why you did it, the action you took, or what you were asked to do, what your situation was, what the task was, and then the action you took to accomplish the task, and then the results of your work or the impact of your action. Now, this really simple model actually works in a variety of ways across a wide range of behavioral interview questions. And that's why I think it's a really excellent example or a tool for you. So I'd like to pull up this model, this example here, and I'll give you a couple of moments to read it, and I'll read it out loud for you as well. And as you read it, I'd like you to dissect it for yourself and identify the situation or task, the action, and the results. I used to work at a museum shop. Every morning before the store opened, I had a checklist of prep work I needed to accomplish: restocking, cleanup, sign changes, etc. I would prioritize my work based on what would have the greatest positive impact on visitors, do that work first, and then follow up with the rest of my list. The store was always ready to go at 11 a.m., which was important at our museum because the store is the first thing people see when they come in. So let's take a look at this in the context of the STAR model. The situation or task in this example is, I used to work in a museum shop. Every morning before the store opened, I had a checklist of prep work I needed to accomplish. That's the situation and that's the task. The action that this person took was, I would prioritize my work based on what would have the greatest positive impact on visitors, do that work first, and then follow up with the rest of my list. The result of that action was primarily the store was always ready to go at 11 a.m. But the bonus result here that I think, Gail, you have some comments on, the bonus result is not just that the store is ready to go at 11 a.m., but it's really important because the store is the first thing people see when they come in. So this tidy little star that was created by a colleague, actually on an index card originally, which I encourage you to do as well, tells an awful lot in a very succinct way. And that succinctness is what needs to come across in your interview. So Gail, I would love to get your quick reactions to this star, especially that bonus result at the end. Gail, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, my internet dropped me there. Sorry. So it exudes dependability. It tells me that the person really understands their role relative to the whole museum, which is fantastic. So it's all about me. It's about how I do my work and it impacts the museum. There was another, the team player and that idea of prioritizing. Brilliant. You know,
Yeah, this is a great example. I really like this one a
yep,
lot.
very good.
And I really encourage all of you to think about using a model like this and using the STAR model: situation, task, action, and results. What's interesting to me about this one is it seems like it's pretty straightforward. Somebody who works in the museum shop, right? It's a retail position and it's kind of task oriented. And yet it has so much more depth to it that, as Gail, you pointed out, really
Definitely.
reveals a lot.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Let's go on to another example that is a little more complex. This happens to be my own example. As those of you who have been in part of the other series and webinars in this series, I tend to use some of my own examples, resumes, cover letters, and such. And here's a STAR that I wrote. Now, I put this one in here. It's a little more complex. It probably would align with some of you who are more at the managerial level or the director level or trying to move up in your career. And the question that was asked of me, and this was when I was interviewing for a job several years ago, the behavioral interview question or prompt that was given to me was, tell me about a time you collaborated to create new projects or initiatives. Tell me about a time you collaborated to create new projects or initiatives. And so here was my STAR. So as I read through it, think for yourself what the situation or task is, what the action is, and what the results are. So here we go. For 10 years, I directed the professional development program at the American Alliance of Museums, where I collaborated with hundreds of subject matter experts to produce programs and resources for museum colleagues across multiple in-person, digital, and print platforms. We launched AAM into online learning with a long-running webinar series. I worked with leadership and management experts to establish Career Cafe at the annual conference. We piloted a multi-year international leadership symposium and a multi-platform audience building program supported by major foundations. And we brought 39 colleagues together as contributing authors to the best-selling book, A Life in Museums, Managing Your Museum Career. In that decade, our collaborative initiatives reached over 100,000 colleagues and 5,500 institutions, grew program participation by 2,900%, and contributed over $1 million earned income to AAM. So let's dissect this. The situation or task in this fairly complex but tidy STAR model is, I was the director of professional development for 10 years, and I was tasked with creating programs and resources for museum colleagues. That was the task. The action I took with those many colleagues over a decade was a variety of things, including AAM's first online learning programs, a career cafe at the annual meeting, an international leadership symposium, and an audience building program, and collaborating with terrific colleagues on a career handbook. That was the action that I took. And the results of that action are here. And you'll notice that they are quantified. There are some numbers here. We talked about that in resumes and cover letter webinars earlier in the series. The result is that we reached over 100,000 colleagues and 5,500 institutions. We grew program participation, and we contributed a significant amount of money to AAM. So one of the things that I had to really work on in this particular model, and Gail, I welcome your feedback here.
Yep.
This is about me, of course. I'm the one being interviewed, and this is the STAR that I prepared in response to a question or a prompt. But the prompt was not entirely about me. It was about collaboration. They asked how I collaborated to create new projects and initiatives. So I really had to work on that. And Gail, I wonder if you have any feedback here on this star.
Well, for me, if I were interviewing you, it tells me several things. Yes, you did the job you were asked, but you went way beyond. You were a connector, you were a problem solver, innovator. I see so much richness in this, not just I did this, this, this. And I know you bring this up, but to have this prepared in advance means that you're able to smoothly share it in the interview versus going, oh, I need to think about that. You want to have that prepared. You also, I made another note from looking at this. You really saw possibilities and ways to connect people in new ways. So to me, full of innovation and resourcefulness, and you facilitated a lot. It just completely jumps off the page there. And I know you'd be saying it verbally, but.
Well, thank you so much. And your point there really is the interview is not the time to wing it. That's why preparing in advance. And Jen, you asked me, you asked in the email, was this an answer I gave to a response in the interview? So I already had some of this information crafted, that I knew I was going to talk about the programs I led and the people I collaborated with and the Career Cafe and the book and all of that. So I knew I knew that I needed to talk about it in some way. So when they actually asked me in an interview how I collaborated, the prompt was, so we see that you've done a number of things. How did you go about producing these in collaboration with others?
Right.
And then I was able to formulate this. I don't want to say on the fly because I already had this construct in my mind. But I'd also prepared a number of other behavioral interview question responses that are fairly typical. So just to recap this section, this is all taking place before the interview. We haven't even gotten to the interview yet. By the time you get to the interview, you should have a handful of these stars in your pocket. Maybe not literally, but I've done index cards, flashcards, something that I can rehearse with a colleague or a friend or a loved one. But this is a really useful model. When you get to the actual interview, I want to ask you, Gail, very quickly. First impressions, how long does it take?
Not no time at all. First, it's how you comport yourself, how you look, the sense of confidence, how, are you smiling and eye contact? I mean, that's the immediate first impression. And then really within the first few minutes, you can tell a lot. So anyway.
Yeah. And as you're talking about first impressions, I'm seeing that James is pointing out, do not literally have cards with you in your interview. Please don't come to the interview with index cards. They're really just like rehearsal cards, flashcards for you. But in preparing for the actual interview, the interviewer has a responsibility to put you at ease, to set the agenda. We're going to do this first, and then we're going to do this. They have the responsibility to facilitate the program at the interview, to take notes. I bolded this bullet because they have the responsibility to do the most listening, which means that you as the interviewee have the responsibility to do the most talking. They will invite questions of you, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. They should indicate next steps and what's going to happen after the interview. And for you as the interviewee, you have the responsibility and the opportunity to consider not only what you say, like your prepared stars, for example, but also, as Gail pointed out earlier, the power of nonverbal communication, how you dress, your haircut, your nails, your jewelry, where you put your purse or your briefcase, or what kind of briefcase it is, whether or not you make eye contact or smile. All of those are nonverbal. Again, this is your opportunity to share information, but you also have to do some level of listening. You most certainly want to respond succinctly and thoughtfully, and that's where your stars come in. Having those prepared keeps you from having to wing it, and that's where people flub. That's where people start rambling, and the next thing you know, it's a 10-minute response and people's eyes have glazed over. I know because I've been there on both sides of the interview table when that's happened. It's also, to that point, an opportunity for you to take a pulse of the interview so that you know when you start to drift, or you know when you're not really responding directly to the question that was asked you, or you know that you're not really addressing the person who asked you the question in a direct way. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll talk about that in a moment because it is essential for you to ask questions when they get to the interview and they say, so do you have any questions for us? The last thing you want to say, in fact, the thing you never want to say is, no, I think you pretty much covered it all. So you absolutely need to have some questions prepared. And if the interviewer hasn't already confirmed the next steps in the process, you need to ask. So can you tell me what will happen next? Well, we've still got 5 more people to interview, and we'll know by the end of the month, or whatever the situation might be. Again, I keep on hitting home on this. Your stars are really critical preparation for you. But also some questions you might ask when it gets to that part of the interview, and there will be that part of the interview. So you might ask questions of the person interviewing you. How would you describe the priorities of this job? You already have a sense of what the priorities are from the job description, from the job posting, or your research on the website, for example. But this would be a great way for you to find out from that person how they describe the priorities of the job. Or you might ask, how would they describe the organizational culture or climate? This is an opportunity for you to get some information to decide if this is in fact a place you might want to work, or maybe it's a place you don't want to work. I've certainly been in interview settings where, having asked this question, I realized, yeah, this is not a place I could work successfully, so thank you very much. You might ask, what results would you like me to produce in the first 3 months or 6 months or year? That gives you a pretty good sense about what they want should you get this job and you need to hit the ground running. Or you might ask, if it's, for example, the person who would be your supervisor, what can you tell me about your work style, and how you might complement that work style or support that work style? So these are all opportunities, questions you might ask. Gail, any feedback you have on this?
I think you've covered it. I was just looking at our time, so I think you've got it.
Okay. But I just want to reemphasize that you really need to ask questions, and they need to be thoughtful questions and not questions like, so what are your core work hours? Or do you offer parking passes, or anything like that? Really not appropriate for the interview. It really needs to be something substantive that can prompt conversation. Some of your comments in the, yes, don't ask about holidays. Helen, thank you. Because those aren't essential to deciding whether you're the right person for this job or not. And some of you in the chat box at the beginning of our program pointed out, this is an opportunity for you to engage in an exchange of information and to get to know each other a little bit better. All the more reason for an opportunity for folks to think, this person is somebody we might want to have it back for another interview, or put in the list of the top 3, for example. So you made it through the interview, great, you're still in one piece, hopefully not sweating too much. But after the interview, the interviewer, in this case, let's say it's Gail, has the responsibility to review the strengths and weaknesses and to gather impressions. Gail, I wonder if you might want to share any thoughts about how your process unfolds in this case.
Well, when I'm doing executive search, I'm basically looking for putting together a slate of the top candidates. So I literally have a grid I'm working with, and I've got the qualities there, and I'm literally evaluating each person against that. the impressions and what I get from the interview process is really allowing me to say, I want to take this person before the executive search committee. That's a big deal, right? To, you know, and I realize, you know, my process has more steps perhaps, but as the interviewer, you know, I immediately sit down, close the door, write my notes, and I might even have a follow-up question I want to ask the individual. I might send them an email or, you know, something along those lines.
Well, and you're also, because everybody's busy, you're going to notify people promptly either way. That's
Yes,
part of your job, right?
it is
Yes,
absolutely.
yes,
I
you
feel
made
that.
it,
Uh-huh.
or no, you didn't. If in the context of somebody being offered a job, you would give them adequate time to decide.
Correct.
I've been offered a job one time where they needed me to decide right then and there because they were behind in the interview process, and I wasn't able to answer them. I was in another interview many years ago, right out of graduate school, where I was equally pressured into responding. I answered, and that was on a Thursday. I had the weekend to think about it, and then I thought, no, this is really not the right choice for me. And I had to turn around and tell them, you know, I've changed my mind, which was not good either. So the point here is that anybody doing their due diligence would give you adequate time. And certainly, Gail, you would be checking references, right? This is
Absolutely.
an
Yes.
opportunity to do that.
Mhm. That's correct. Sometimes the references can't be checked until the person's a finalist because it's, say, the president of the board or whatever. But references are really need you as the interviewee need to think very carefully who you ask to be a reference. You want someone who can speak to your actual work time, your achievements, not just someone you know professionally because you're both on you work together on a committee for an association. That's you want someone who can speak to your work experience. So you want to check those very carefully and
Yeah,
let them
and
know in advance.
absolutely. If you have references, make sure that they know you're on. They know that they're on your reference list. You don't want anybody to be surprised when a recruiter or
Right.
somebody calls for a reference. Obviously, Gail, you would maintain confidentiality and discretion.
Absolutely.
That's on everybody's side. On the interviewee's side, you still need to send a thank you note. I just need to tell everybody. It can be an email, and that's okay. A handwritten thank you note is even better, but also an opportunity for you to brush up on your penmanship. It's also an opportunity to offer a follow-up resource, a reminder. Let's say, for example, in your interview, you talked about an article you wrote or some reference that has something to do with the job or one of the people interviewing you expressed an interest in. Here's an opportunity to offer a follow-up resource, which is just one more thing for them to consider for you. I really encourage everybody to consider what went well and what didn't. Be reflective and say, you know, okay, I did this really well, but yeah, maybe not so good on that. Next time I won't do that thing. Absolutely don't stalk. If the interviewer told you we've got 5 more candidates to review and we'll know in 2 weeks, then don't email them the next week and say, have you decided yet? You would wait 2 weeks to reach out politely. Certainly, as I talked about, if offered the position, take the time to decide and exercise discretion. Just because you think you had a great interview doesn't mean that you need to go telling everybody about the great interview you had, because then you may not get it, and then you're kind of stuck. And speaking of, what if you don't get the job? We've all been in that position. It can be really devastating, as this guy on the screen looks like he's pretty dejected. My sincere advice, without being glib at all, is let it go. Reflect on it. Decide what you did well and what you didn't do well. Learn from it. Learn how you might brush up your materials, how you might brush up your interviewing skills, and then let it go. because you need to move on to the next job application and the next interview process. And Gail, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this. This is not the time to be grumpy or cranky or reach out to the recruiter and say, you know, why not? Why didn't you pick me? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think be kind to yourself. Give yourself some quiet time, do something nice for yourself, take the notes as Greg suggested. Sometimes situations reveal some discrimination, which is, we don't have time to talk about that here. And that's a whole other conversation. But I think it's a moment to take stock. Oftentimes, it's a blessing in disguise. Sometimes it was, I often tell myself, wasn't meant to be. And, I'm not so oblivious to owning my part of the, if I didn't get the job, but, you want to take the high road.
Absolutely. And a couple of folks in the audience are asking about asking for feedback. There's nothing particularly wrong with asking for feedback, as long as you're doing it in a respectful way that doesn't hint at dejection or bitterness. If what you're really interested in is knowing what you could do better for the next time you interview, then that's a sincere ask. However, if they've told you in the email, please don't call us, please don't contact us, which I have had that happen, there's no way that I would reach out to them and say, how come you didn't pick me? And also, if you're gonna ask for feedback and they decline or they just don't respond, then you absolutely can't stalk. It just, you need to rely on your own gut and what you did well and what you didn't well and move on. I know that we're down at the bottom of our hour, and I want to, I know, Gail, that you got to scoot, but thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stick around for a handful of minutes to address some of the questions, but as we like to do with each of our webinars, encourage you to take one small step in the spirit of Kaizen. Small step, big impact. What steps will you take to prepare for your next interview? I'll give you a hint, what I think one of your steps would be. No big
surprise.
No surprise. But there's a lot of things you could do in terms of preparing for your next interview. And to be fair, you may not have an interview coming up right now or immediately, but you will have an interview at some point. It may not be next week or next month. But we'll always have interviews. And so the more prepared you can be, the better off you will be. So let's pause here for a moment. And I want to thank you again, Gail, for being a part of our program.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Great. Thanks so much, Gail. And as you all know, as we take some questions, I would love to get some feedback from you. But I want to look and see what we've got here. Yeah, James said, indeed, the why didn't you pick me question will only lead to pain. Helen, your comment, one door closes and another one opens. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Jen, I've actually asked for feedback and gotten good feedback, which I appreciated, but I will admit that it's largely has been from people who I would consider really, I don't want to say people aren't thoughtful, but these are colleagues who are really generous, who understand that this thing called interviewing can be pretty challenging. So I really appreciate that. And James, I want to acknowledge, thank you for being such a great proxy for answering a whole bunch of questions in the chat box. Thank you so much. Your comment about somebody's comment about them shutting down the formal part of the interview and then turning to the questions part where they stop taking notes and send cues. Well, maybe they've gotten what they need out of you, but they've also set the agenda that you will have the opportunity to ask questions. And so just need to sally forth and make it work. Anything else here? Let's take a look here. Dylan, you're asking if you've gone through the filtering process of a phone interview, an in-person, and a panel interview, and you do not get the job, is it inappropriate to ask for feedback? Again, if you want to ask for feedback, do it respectfully, and if they don't respond to you, then you just need to let it go. I've been on a couple of interviews in my life where I thought I nailed it. I thought it was a great interview. I left just beaming and glowing, and then I didn't get the job. So, but I've also been in interviews where right in the middle of the interview, and it was a set of panel interviews over a whole day where I was being interviewed by groups of people. I knew about halfway through that I wasn't cutting it. I just knew, and it was just something I could tell it after lunch. I knew, but I still had to hold myself up. I still had to prepare. I still had to deliver my stars, and make the best of it. There was a little commentary from Joanna and Jen and James about the stars and my particular example, perhaps making sense in a written interview, but would that level of quantifiable impact be expected conversationally? Absolutely. Doesn't have to be those exact words or even that length of a response. But as James pointed out, when you start having those numbers memorized, when you start having the situation or task, the action and the results memorized in very short, digestible format, then you can start pulling them out when you need them, when you can respond without having to wing it. So yeah, I really encourage you to have that level of detail, even if you don't, even if the answer doesn't come, even if the question doesn't come your way, at least you had the opportunity to prepare. So better prepared than not. Hannah, you asked earlier about places where you can find up-to-date information about what can or cannot be asked in an interview in each state. James, you mentioned the State Attorney General's office, the Office of Employment, maybe some information. That's actually a really good question, Hannah. I'll probably need to do a little bit of homework on that. But some of the general things that you're really not allowed to ask are about your marital status, or whether you have kids or not, or if you have childcare, or certainly nothing about disabilities, anything like that. I noticed a couple of people talked about doing 990 research. Looking into those can be really useful in terms of the tax form 990s that reveals some financial information. What else? We talked a little bit about gaps in employment, but I want to circle back around on that because in my career, I've certainly had some gaps, and one of the things that, or short-term, either contract or part-time employment. And it's always best to be prepared to talk about it, because if that's on your resume, on your materials, somebody's going to ask about it. So, it might be that you took some time off to take care of a family member, which is something they can't ask you, but you can offer it if you choose to. You can certainly, for example, I went on an interview one time where they looked at my resume and it had several short-term employments, but then there were these two big chunks of 10 years plus. So I diverted attention to the two chunks of employment that were over 10 years, just to make sure that that was the area of emphasis. Somebody asked here, about asking about the toolkit. The toolkit can really be anything that you want it to be. At a minimum, it should be really nicely printed copies of your resume and your cover letter. And as you recall, they both need to look exactly the same as part of the same package that you're presenting. You might also include a writing sample. Let's say you've written an article or some kind of report that demonstrates your ability to communicate in writing. It may be an infographic of some sort that gets to some of what you are an expert at. I've done them simply going down to Office Depot or such, and or a place like that, and buying really nice folders and including a business card and printed copies of my resume, perhaps my CV, a cover letter, and a writing sample. And having enough available for whoever you think is going to be there. I went on an interview once. They told me it was going to be with 6 people, and I had 6 copies, and then they invited all the senior staff. So all of a sudden there were 12 people in the room, and I had 6. So they all had to share, and I just made the best of it. Some continuing questions about the stars. Stars, I think, are not just an opportunity to prepare for an interview, but I think that they are really good practice on a number of levels, which I think, James, you caught on to a little bit. That level of brevity and conciseness and succinctness is something that can translate well to your cover letter. It can translate well to perhaps some version of a summary statement on the top of your resume, or the summary statement or a short bio on your LinkedIn profile. These are ways of getting the information out of your head and in a concise format that you can use. The other bonus, assuming that you are working, that the stars can actually serve a great purpose when you get to performance review time. So if somebody needs to find out from you what you've done, then you have all of these stars ready to go. You're able to communicate the situation and the task, the action and results. And those are the very things that get asked in a performance review. Rebounding from an awkward question in an interview. Oh, I don't have an amazing response for that. We've all been thrown curveball questions. And oftentimes those curveball questions are intentional. So they're deliberate to see how you can deal with the curveball, the ambiguity or the change. My approach typically has been to make a note of it. So visibly make a note of their question and say, I'd love to have just a moment to process that and let me get back to you. And when I've done that, people are pretty okay with that. And then that buys me an extra 30 or 45 seconds or a minute, whatever it might be, to get some information organized in my head. What would be a suitable length for an interview? It really depends. Phone screening interviews, often 30 minutes. An in-person interview, usually maybe an hour, but it really depends. If you advance to the finalist stage, especially for a management or some director level position, probably a day-long affair with multiple meetings and coffee dates and perhaps lunches or even a social event. A word of caution about those kinds of things when you're when you're eating or drinking with people in a professional setting. Avoid alcohol. Really don't drink in front of people, because some people just can't hold it together. So that's important. Let's see, anything else in here? Okay, well, I'm going to comb through here and see if I'll stay online for a little bit longer and see if I can tackle some of these questions But I do want to acknowledge that Gail's presence earlier in our conversation. And of course, to reach out and say thank you to my fine colleagues at the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums and the Virginia Association of Museums for being good partners, and to all of you for joining in today's program. And certainly for those of you who have joined the entire series, I appreciate that. And if you do have any thoughts about other career-related topics that we might cover, or maybe something a little bit more in depth on one of the topics we covered in this series, I would certainly love to hear from you. If you need to reach out to me, I think you all know how to get a hold of me, either by email, or you can visit my website, purplecowcareers.com. You can also find me on Twitter at DC Greg Stevens and LinkedIn at Greg Stevens PD. Thank you all for joining today. On behalf of Purple Cow, have a terrific day.